Why did Solon of Athens say, "Count no man happy until he is dead"? It's one of those really interesting phrases because you imagine someone could be happy while they were alive, so why would he say, "Count no one happy until they're dead"? Well, it goes back to sort of an ancient wisdom principle that you really can't know the quality of someone's life until the very end of it. Someone may look happy for a season and then become unhappy in the fall. Someone may be happy for a moment and then sad the next morning. To speak of someone's happiness as the sort of flowing state of emotions and feelings is really to speak of not happiness. For us today, happiness seems to be like the explosion of feeling that you have in a moment, full of endorphins and all other sorts of things. But at least in the ancient world, or at least for Solon in particular, for him, happiness was the quality of an entire life lived, one which would only be revealed at the end. You think about someone like Paul the Apostle, who said that he has fought the good fight, that he has pursued this fight until the very end of his life. And there's a real sense in which there's a quality of life that can be described based upon the end. So where does Solon give this advice? And I think the answer to that question as well really clarifies what he means by this sort of maxim that you can count no one happy until they are dead. So Solon is this Athenian lawmaker. He's one of the, I think, considered one of the seven sages of the ancient kind of Athenian like lawmaking, policy making, whatever kind of group. And he does this legal reform in Athens and realizes that in order to avoid the pressure of taking away the laws that he made, he needs to actually leave the city and travel. So everyone, I guess, agrees to obey his laws that he created for about 10 years. So he travels for 10 years to give them a trial run so that he's not local and therefore can be pressured in order to repeal these laws. And during his travels, he eventually goes to a place called Lydia, or Sardis, which is the capital of the Lydian Empire. And Lydia is basically West Turkey today. And there he meets a king named Croesus. And Croesus is this king who has been conquering all sorts of kingdoms around him. He's very powerful, very wealthy, very rich, and one that you might consider to be this exceptionally happy person. Many of the learned Greeks we learn from Herodotus' history were traveling there. And so it is that Solon also travels there. He enters into the royal palace. And then Solon had seen everything, all the wealth, all the greatness, all the treasuries, all that kind of stuff. After this, Croesus asks Solon to come and to speak to him. And Croesus says to him, "We have heard a good deal about you, my guest from Athens. You have a reputation as a wise and well-traveled man. As a philosopher, indeed, one who has traveled the world and always kept his eyes wide open. So here is the question I would like to put to you. Have you ever come across anyone whose state of contentment would rank head and shoulders above that of everyone else?" Herodotus tells us. In asking this, of course, he was taking for granted that the answer would be himself. But Solon, rather than indulge in flattery, preferred instead to speak what he saw as the truth. Here's the answer. "Yes, my lord," he answered, "an Athenian by the name of Tellus." The reply took Croesus back. "And why exactly," he demanded in a heated tone, "do you reckon this Tellus to have been so happy?" "There are two reasons," Solon answered. "Firstly, he lived at a time when his city was particularly well off. He had handsome, upstanding sons, and he ended up a grandfather with all his grandchildren making it to adulthood. Secondly, at a time when, by our standards, he was a man of considerable wealth, his life came to an end that was as glorious as its course had previously been happy." What happened was this. The Athenians were fighting a battle against their neighbors at Eleusis when Tellus stepped into the breach of their crumbling line and put the enemy to flight. It is true that he himself died, but his death was something beautiful. And the Athenians gave him a state funeral at the very spot where he fell and awarded him splendid honors. This discourse of Solon's, with its cataloging of all the ways in which Tellus had been happy, had certainly served to pique Croesus' interest. And so it was, confident that he would be named the runner-up at least, he asked Solon for the name of the second happiest person on the list. By the way, I'm reading this edition of Herodotus' Histories. It's translated by Tom Holland. So the runner-up to the list, Solon answered, was Cleobus and Biton, 2 young men of Argos, because they never lacked for means, and also because of their remarkable physical strength. Not only were they both prize-winning athletes, but there is also the following story told about them. The episode took place during an Argive festival in honor of Hera, when their mother urgently needed to be driven to the temple in their cart. But early in the day, before the oxen had been brought back in from the fields, there being no time to lose, the 2 young men shouldered the yoke themselves and pulled the cart, with their mother riding on top of it for a full 45 stadies, all the way to the temple. Everyone who had gathered for the festival was witness to this exploit, and then in its wake the 2 young men died in the best possible way, a divinely authored proof that it is better to be dead than alive. The Argives kept crowding round them, congratulating them on their strength, and the women of the city kept telling their mother how fortunate she was in her children. In due course, such was the rapture of her joy at her son's achievement and the fame they had won, that she went to stand before the statue of Hera, and prayed to the goddess that she would bestow upon her children, her Cleobus and Biton, who had brought her such great honor, the greatest blessing that it is possible for mortals to be granted. The mother finished her prayer, and then came the sacrifices and the feasting, and then the young men passed inside the temple and fell asleep, never to wake up again. And in this way their lives were brought to a close. The Argives made statues of them, which were then sent to Delphi, for it is clear that they had been the very best that man can be. But Solon's nomination of these 2 young men for a second place in his list of the happiest people known to him threw Croesus into a rage. "And what of my own happiness, my Athenian friend?" he demanded. "Is it so beneath contempt that it is not even to be mentioned in the same breath as that of men without rank or title?" "Croesus," Solon replied, "your question was one that touched on the lot of humanity, and I answered, it is as someone who is all too well familiar of how jealous the gods are and how perplexing their ways how perplexing in their ways." Then Solon goes on to speak about how there's a limit to life and things can be up and down at different times. Human life is nothing, he says, if not subject to the vagaries of chance. And then he makes this intriguing point. He says, I will not be able to say about you what you were anticipating that I would say until I have learned that you died contentedly. Great wealth, after all, is no more guaranteed to bring man happiness than his daily subsistence, unless, that is, good fortune proves to be the rich man's constant companion, and so on. And his point isn't that, you're happy if you have wealth your whole life or whatever, but you're happy when you have this sort of successful, heroic quality of life, and you die in the same way that you lived. So, as he goes on, he makes this kind of famous statement. He says, "And if, in addition to all these advantages, he dies as well as he lived, well, there you have the kind of man you are looking for. One who truly merits the epithet of happy. But until he is dead, do not go leaping to any conclusions, for he is not yet truly happy, only fortunate." You may have a fortunate life. You may be up one day and then down the next day. That's the point. You may have a day of fortune, then a day of misfortune. But that's not really happiness. Happiness is really having all the advantages of life and having a consistent, fortunate life, or at least plowing through the difficulties of life, just like the man went to war and stood in the breach. It wasn't that it was easy, and he in fact died during that time, but he had a heroic quality of life. He did the right thing. He lived what we might say is a happy life. Well, some years later, Croesus would learn this lesson. He went to war with the Persians and was roundly defeated, and Cyrus of the Persians decided to burn him on a pyre. And during this time, Solon's on the pyre realizes the maxim that Croesus on the pyre realized the maxim that Solon had told him, that no one living ranks as happy. And there he realized, before his expected death, he didn't actually die. There's few things that happen. But there he, in his expected death, he finally realizes Solon's wisdom. That you can call no one happy until they're dead. Because you don't know the fullness or the quality of their life until it's at their end. The word dead here in this context, call no one happy until they're dead, is more literally call no one happy or blessed until their end has been met. It is a word here, for example, teleftese, in Histories 132:7. Well, is this helpful to us today? I think the answer is basically yes. Most of us live our lives pursuing a constant sort of adrenaline fix, a dopamine fix. We think that we're happy if we just do one more trip or have one more like on our social media or whatever. We think about our lives primarily in the here and now, and our happiness or joy is in the moment. But if we don't think about the end, we won't be able to organize the beginning and middle of our life. If you remember your death, as some of the Latin Stoics would say, if you remember your death, if you remember the end of all things, then that gives you a sort of, a guide stone to living your life here in the present. In fact, that's what Solon gets at when he's talking to Croesus. He talks about how men live for about 70 years, and he starts counting up the days. He says, these are just the days of your life. Like, it is not long. It is sort of this, if memory serves, I think the point he's trying to illustrate that it's like this sort of quick time. And you have to make good on those days. It's not that you have infinite amount of time. What does he say here? That means that your 70 years of life will give you, he has a bunch of calculations for different sorts of days, but he says 26,250 days in all, and not one of them will resemble the next in terms of what it brings. So you can see, Croesus, how human life is nothing if not the subject to the vagaries of chance. By chance here, he more or less means that you don't know what tomorrow will bring. He is saying, as someone else has said before, to teach us to number our days. Teach us to number our days so that we might know how to live. This is actually from Psalm 90 in verses 12 and following. And if memory serves, it's the words of Moses, actually. He says, so teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long, and let it repent thee concerning thy servant. So satisfy us early with thy mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad in all our days. Make us glad according to the days wherein thou hast afflicted us, and the years wherein we have seen evil. Let thy work appear unto thy servants, and thy glory unto their children. And let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish thou the work of our hands upon us. Yea, the work of our hands, establish thou it. What an interesting psalm. And you see some of the overlapping ideas in terms of wisdom with Solon. We are to number our days, just as Solon also says, so that we may know how to live. It gives us a sort of wisdom. If we know there is a certain span to life and then it ends, we live in light of the end. We live differently in light of that end. And as Moses says, there are many days of affliction, many days of up and down. There's this, now Moses wouldn't believe in chance, but the idea is that you don't know what tomorrow will bring. It can be suffering tomorrow, it can be joy next week. But the point is, we still need to live by wisdom, and we still need to live by mercy. Whereas Solon might say that the gods are fickle and hard to understand, Moses would say that God is merciful and compassionate and long-suffering. It may be that you don't always understand his ways. There's a similarity in terms of a human perspective that we don't know what God will do per se, but we can know that he is good. Reminded that kind of famous C.S. Lewis scene in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where I think it's Lucy is asking Mr. Beaver, after learning that Aslan is a lion, is he safe? And Mr. or Mrs. Beaver, can't remember, says, oh my, no. Where did you ever get that idea? He's a wild lion. He isn't safe, but he is good. He is the true king. Something like that is true with the God of the Bible, the God of Moses. And that truth, I think, clarifies what is lacking in Solon's wisdom. Solon is right that we should number our days to live wisely. I think he is right to say that the end of our life tells us whether we've lived a happy or good or fulfilled life. But because he views the gods as basically superhumans, just as fickle as we are, there is no sense of you're able to just trust in God to be good and merciful and just, so that when you see the sort of seeming chance or the vagaries of chance that just seems like tomorrow and the next day don't work the way that you expect them to, instead of going, well, the gods are just crazy, you can say, no, God is good, and I will trust my steps into him because he knows the end from the beginning. So why did Solon say you cannot never call a person happy until he's dead? Simply because the end of someone's life tells us the quality of their life. But there are some limits into what he can say. And the limits are, you're really living according to the vagaries of fickle gods. And so it's not really under your control. And yes, that is true, and fate is kind of controls everything. It's not really under your control if you think of yourself as being able to control everything. But Moses, I think, had the right perspective. Because there is one God, the God who created heaven and earth, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who is merciful and good and compassionate. Even though we see evil, the beauty of the Lord our God, he says, may be upon us. Now, Solon talked about a beautiful death. And it was beautiful, he said, because someone died for their country. But what if God himself is beauty, and all of us can experience the beauty, a beautiful death, by following him for our entire life?